Good morning. Darling, your usual Margaret said, placing the crystal coffee cup on the marble countertop with practiced precision. The espresso machine hissed in the background, while morning news played softly from the kitchen television. Richard barely looked up from his phone. Make it a double. Board meeting at 9. The 53-year-old woman watched her millionaire ex-husband scroll through messages, his jaw tightening with each swipe. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read his moods like weather patterns, and storm clouds were definitely gathering. Margaret moved through their upscale Connecticut kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had perfected this morning routine over 2 decades. Crystal cups, imported coffee beans, fresh cream in a sterling silver pitcher. Everything exactly as Richard preferred, exactly as she had done for 20 years of marriage. Time is money, Margaret, Richard said without looking up, his standard corporate catchphrase that had somehow invaded their personal life. The acquisition papers need reviewing before the Hartford meeting. Of course, she replied, stirring his coffee counterclockwise exactly 3 times. She had learned long ago that Richard's preferences were not suggestions but requirements in their household. As she handed him the perfectly prepared cup, Margaret noticed something that made her stomach flutter with unease. A smudge of lipstick on his white collar. Deep red, almost burgundy. Not her shade. She wore soft pinks and corals. Never anything so bold. She opened her mouth to mention it, then closed it again. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Her mother had always said, pick your wars carefully. Margaret. Richard drained his coffee in 3 large gulps and grabbed his briefcase. Don't wait up. This deal is going to run late. He kissed her cheek absently, the same way he had signed contracts for the past 5 years. Perfunctory, necessary, meaningless. After the garage door closed, Margaret stood alone in her pristine kitchen, staring at the lipstick-stained collar in her mind. She thought about calling her sister Linda in California, but what would she say that her husband had lipstick on his shirt, that he barely looked at her anymore? That their 20-year marriage felt more like a business arrangement than a partnership. Instead, she loaded the dishwasher and planned her day. Grocery shopping, dry cleaning pickup, dinner preparation for Richard's return. The same routine that had structured her adult life. The same schedule that had made her feel secure and purposeful. But today, something felt different. The lipstick had cracked something open inside her. A tiny fissure in the foundation of her carefully constructed world. Margaret walked to the bathroom mirror and studied her reflection. 53 years old, blonde hair still thick but requiring more maintenance than she cared to admit. Laugh lines that had become worry lines. A woman who had spent her 30s and 40s supporting her husband's career, hosting his business dinners, managing his household, raising his profile in the community. When had she stopped being Margaret and become simply Richard's wife? The thought surprised her with its clarity. She had been thinking of herself as Richard's wife for so long that she had forgotten she was also Margaret Patterson. The woman who had graduated magna cum laude with a degree in interior design, who had once dreamed of opening her own firm, who had postponed her ambitions to build his... She poured herself a second cup of coffee, something she rarely did. Usually, she cleaned up immediately after Richard left, maintaining the spotless kitchen that their housekeeper complimented every Tuesday. But today, she sat at the kitchen island and allowed herself the luxury of a quiet moment. The morning news droned on about stock market fluctuations and political scandals. Margaret found herself wondering if this was what midlife transformation felt like. Not the dramatic breakdown she had read about in women's magazines, but a quiet awakening, a gradual recognition that the life you were living might not be the life you had chosen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Thinking of you. Sis. How are things? Margaret stared at the message for a long moment, her finger hovering over the keyboard. How were things? How could she explain that everything looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow from within? That her millionaire ex-husband provided everything she could want, except the one thing she needed most to feel valued as an individual, rather than as an accessory to his success. She typed back a simple response. All good here. Talk soon. But as she pressed send, Margaret knew that all good was the furthest thing from the truth. Something was shifting in her marriage. Something that went deeper than lipstick stains and morning coffee routines. Little did Margaret know, this quiet Tuesday morning would be the last normal day of her marriage. The coffee grew cold in her cup as she stared out the kitchen window at their manicured lawn, watching their neighbor Tom working in his garden. He waved when he noticed her, the same friendly gesture he had offered every morning for the past 3 years since his own divorce. Margaret waved back, remembering how Richard had commented just last week about Tom's excessive friendliness. Divorced men are always looking for their next victim, he had said with the casual cruelty that had become his default tone. She had defended Tom then, pointing out that he was simply being neighborly. But Richard's response had been swift and cutting. "You're too trusting, Margaret. Men like that don't do favors without expecting something in return." Now, watching Tom tend his roses with obvious care and attention, Margaret wondered if Richard's suspicion said more about Richard than it did about Tom. After all, what kind of person assumed the worst of basic human kindness? The kitchen phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Richard's assistant, confirming dinner reservations for Thursday night. A business dinner, she was told. No spouses invited. Another dinner alone. Another evening of reheated leftovers and cable television. Margaret thanked the assistant politely and hung up, but the call had added another crack to her already fragile composure. 20 years of marriage, and she could count on one hand the number of business dinners she had been invited to attend in the past year. She used to be an essential part of Richard's professional image, the charming wife who remembered clients' names and their children's accomplishments, who could turn an awkward business gathering into a warm social event. When had she become a liability rather than an asset? Margaret finished her coffee and finally began her morning cleanup routine. But her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. For the first time in decades, she found herself wondering what her life might look like if she weren't Mrs. Richard Patterson. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As she wiped down the marble countertop one final time, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She was going to pay attention, really pay attention, to the lipstick stains and the late meetings and the business dinners that excluded wives, to the way Richard spoke to her and about her, to the growing distance between the life she was living and the life she wanted. She didn't know it yet, but her days of accepting explanations without question, of choosing silence over confrontation, of prioritizing peace over truth, were about to end. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the spotless floor. And Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, curiosity about her own future. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the crystal stemware in the dining room cabinet. Margaret looked up from her book, recognizing the particular rhythm of Richard's anger and his heavy footsteps crossing the hardwood floors. "Margaret, get in here. Now." His voice carried the sharp edge she had learned to fear over their years together. Not the volume of shouting, but the cold precision of a man who expected immediate compliance. Margaret set down her novel and walked toward Richard's home office, her heart already beginning to race. Richard stood behind his mahogany desk, still wearing his charcoal business suit but with his tie loosened and his face flushed with fury. His briefcase lay open on the floor where he had apparently thrown it, papers scattered across the Persian rug. "We need to talk," he said, but his tone suggested this would be more interrogation than conversation. "Of course," Margaret replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "What's wrong?" Richard's laugh was harsh and bitter. "What's wrong? What's wrong is that I spent my entire board meeting today fielding questions about my wife's inappropriate relationship with our neighbor." Margaret blinked, genuinely confused. "What inappropriate relationship? Don't play dumb with me," Richard snapped. "Tom Morrison, the divorced man next door who seems to have unlimited time to help with your little projects around the house." The accusation was so unexpected, so completely unfounded, that Margaret struggled to find words. "Tom fixed my car last week when it wouldn't start. He brought me coffee while I waited for the mechanic. That's called being neighborly?" Richard, Neighborly, Richard repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call sitting on the front porch with another man, laughing and carrying on while I'm working 60-hour weeks to pay for this house? Margaret felt the familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach, the way Richard's accusations always made her question her own perceptions. I wasn't carrying on with anyone. Tom helped me with a car problem, and we had coffee. Two neighbors having a normal conversation. Normal conversation, Richard said, beginning to pace behind his desk. Let me tell you what's normal. Margaret, normal is a wife who supports her husband's career instead of embarrassing him in front of business associates. Normal is discretion and loyalty, not flirting with the first available man who shows you attention. The unfairness of his attack struck her like a physical blow. Flirting, Richard? I haven't flirted with anyone in 20 years. I've been nothing but loyal to you and to our marriage. 20 years of marriage, Richard continued, his voice rising now. And this is how you repay me, by making me look like a fool in front of people who control million-dollar contracts. Margaret stood up, her own voice finally finding strength. I have never, ever been unfaithful to you. The fact that you would even suggest such a thing shows how little you know me after all these years. That's when Richard's hand moved faster than her reflexes could follow. The slap echoed through the home office like a gunshot. Margaret's head snapped to the side from the impact, her cheek immediately beginning to sting and burn. She raised her hand to touch the spot where his palm had connected, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Silence filled the room, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and Margaret's sharp intake of breath. How dare you, Richard said, his voice cold as winter. I've given you everything. This house, that car, those designer clothes hanging in your closet. I've provided for you, protected you, built a life that most women would kill for. And you throw it all away for what, neighborly coffee with a divorced man who's obviously looking for his next conquest. Margaret stared at her husband, really seeing him perhaps for the first time in years. The man she had married had been ambitious but kind, driven but considerate. The person standing before her now was someone she barely recognized. Someone who could justify hitting his wife because she had accepted help from a neighbor. I never asked for designer clothes, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I never asked to be provided for like some kind of dependent child. What I asked for was partnership, respect, basic human kindness. You want respect, Richard laughed bitterly. Earn it. Stop making me look like a cuckold in front of my colleagues, and maybe we can talk about respect. The word hit her like a second slap. Cuckold. As if her imaginary infidelity was primarily about his wounded ego rather than any actual betrayal of their marriage vows. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, Margaret said, turning toward the door. You'll sleep wherever I tell you to sleep, Richard called after her. This is my house, bought with my money, and you'll follow my rules while you're living under my roof. Margaret paused in the doorway without turning around. Your rules, she repeated. Not our marriage, not our home, not our decisions. Your rules in your house with your money. That's right, Richard said. And you'd better remember that before you decide to play house with the neighbor again. Margaret walked upstairs to the guest bedroom, her cheeks still burning from the impact of Richard's hand. She locked the door behind her and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to touch the tender spot where he had struck her. Have you ever been accused of something so ridiculous, so unfair, that words just disappeared from your mouth? Margaret thought about women who would understand this moment. Her sister Linda, who had warned her about Richard's controlling tendencies 20 years ago. Her college friend Jennifer, who had survived her own difficult divorce. Her mother, who had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting. But what her mother hadn't taught her was what to do when the battle came to you, whether you wanted it or not. Margaret looked around the guest bedroom, with its neutral beige walls and impersonal hotel furniture. This room had always felt temporary, a place for visiting relatives and overflow guests during dinner parties. Now it felt like sanctuary, a space where Richard's anger couldn't follow, where his accusations couldn't reshape reality to fit his paranoid assumptions. She thought about Tom Morrison, working in his garden every morning with patient dedication. In the 3 years since his own divorce, he had never been anything but respectful and kind. He helped elderly Mrs. Chen with her groceries. He shoveled snow from the sidewalks of neighbors he barely knew. He had fixed Margaret's car because it was the right thing to do. The idea that such basic human decency could be twisted into evidence of an affair would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, she hoped it might be Richard, apologizing for his behavior, recognizing that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Instead, it was Linda. Call me when you get a chance. I have news about my promotion. Margaret stared at the message, remembering her sister's successful career in marketing, her independence, her ability to make decisions about her own life without seeking permission from a husband who saw partnership as ownership. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret began to wonder what financial independence after 50 might actually look like. She turned off the bedside lamp and lay down fully clothed, her cheeks still tender against the pillow. Outside her window, she could see the light in Tom's kitchen, where he was probably preparing his own simple dinner, living his own quiet life, completely unaware that his neighborly kindness had somehow become grounds for domestic violence. Tomorrow, Margaret decided, she would begin asking questions about credit card statements and business dinners and lipstick stains and all the small deceptions that had accumulated over the years like sediment in a riverbed. Tonight, she would sleep alone in the guest room, the locked door a fragile barrier between her and a husband who no longer felt like her partner in anything. The last thing she heard before drifting off to sleep was Richard's voice downstairs, on the phone with someone, his tone warm and affectionate in a way he hadn't spoken to her in years. Margaret closed her eyes and began planning her next move. The bathroom mirror reflected more than Margaret had expected to see. The bruise along her left cheekbone had deepened overnight, from red to purple, a vivid reminder of how quickly 20 years of marriage could be reduced to a moment of violence. She traced the tender skin with her fingertip, marveling at how something so small could represent such a massive shift in her understanding of her own life. Yesterday morning, she had been a wife who occasionally questioned her husband's behavior. Today, she was a woman who needed to decide whether to cover bruises with makeup or document them with photographs. The shower provided temporary sanctuary, hot water washing away the physical remnants of yesterday's confrontation, but doing nothing to ease the emotional aftermath. Margaret stood under the spray longer than usual, using the time to organize her thoughts and plan her next steps. When she emerged, wrapped in her terry cloth robe, her phone was already ringing. Linda's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for her sister's impeccable timing. "Hey, sis," Linda said without preamble. "You sounded weird in your text yesterday." "What's going on?" Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, suddenly unsure how to begin. "How did you tell someone that your seemingly stable marriage had revealed itself to be built on quicksand?" "Something's wrong with Richard," she said finally. "He's become paranoid, angry, accusing me of things I'd never do." Linda's voice sharpened with concern. What kind of things? Margaret explained yesterday's confrontation, the absurd accusation about Tom, and the slap that had followed her denial. She spoke quietly, aware that Richard was somewhere in the house, probably preparing for another day at the office where he would maintain his professional facade while she dealt with the domestic wreckage. "Oh, honey," Linda said when Margaret finished, "in my experience, when men start pointing fingers at their wives, they've usually got three pointing back at themselves." The observation hit Margaret with the force of recognition. Of course, the oldest story in the world: accuse your spouse of the behavior you're actually engaging in yourself. "What should I do?" Margaret asked. "First, take pictures of that bruise," Linda said firmly. "Document everything. Then start paying attention to his patterns. Men who cheat and men who hit usually aren't very creative about hiding their tracks." After they hung up, Margaret did exactly as Linda suggested. She photographed her bruised cheek from multiple angles, saved the images to a password-protected folder on her phone, and began making mental notes about Richard's recent behavior changes. The late meetings that had become more frequent over the past 6 months, the business dinners that excluded wives, the credit card statements she had stopped reviewing because Richard handled all their finances. The cologne that smelled different from his usual brand. Margaret waited until Richard left for work, listening for the garage door to close before beginning her search. If she was going to investigate her own husband, she needed to be thorough and careful. Richard's home computer was password protected, but Margaret had been paying attention for 20 years. She tried his birth year, their anniversary, his social security number. Nothing worked. But when she entered the name of his first company, followed by his lucky number 7, the screen unlocked. The browser history had been cleared, but email notifications were still visible in his taskbar. Dinner reservations at restaurants she had never been to. Meeting confirmations for times when he claimed to be working late. Shipping notifications for jewelry purchases she had never received. Her hands trembled as she opened his email account. Most of the correspondence was legitimately business-related, but buried among the corporate communications were personal messages that made her stomach churn. Amanda, personal trainer. The name appeared repeatedly in his contact list, with messages dating back 6 months. Margaret clicked on the most recent exchange. Richard, tonight's meeting ran late. Can we reschedule for Thursday, Amanda? Of course, baby. I'll keep the room until you get there. Miss you. Richard, miss you too. The situation at home is getting complicated. Amanda, maybe it's time to tell her about us. I'm tired of being your secret. Richard, not yet. The timing has to be right. Margaret read the exchange 3 times before the full implication settled in. Amanda wasn't just a personal trainer. She was Richard's mistress, and their affair had been going on for at least 6 months while he accused Margaret of imaginary infidelity. The hypocrisy was staggering, but the betrayal cut even deeper. While Margaret had been planning dinner parties and managing household schedules and supporting Richard's career advancement, he had been building an entirely separate relationship with another woman. She scrolled through more messages, piecing together the timeline of the affair. Hotel reservations charged to their joint credit card. Expensive gifts that Amanda had apparently chosen herself. Weekend trips disguised as business conferences. Margaret printed the most damaging emails and hid them in her jewelry box, then cleared the browser history to match Richard's usual pattern. If he was going to play games with evidence, she could learn the rules quickly enough. Her next stop was Richard's closet, where she found his gym bag tucked behind his winter coats. Inside, beneath his workout clothes, was a second cell phone she had never seen before. The phone was password protected, but Margaret remembered Richard's old combination from their early dating years. He had always been sentimental about numbers, using the same passwords and PIN codes for everything. The hidden phone contained a treasure trove of evidence, text messages between Richard and Amanda that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship, photos that confirmed Amanda was young, blonde, and everything Margaret was no longer, voicemails that referenced hotel rooms and anniversary celebrations, and intimate details that made Margaret feel sick. But the most damaging discovery was a voicemail from Amanda that had been left just 2 days ago. Richard, sweetie, I can't wait to see you tonight. The hotel room is booked under your usual name. Wear that cologne I bought you for our 6-month anniversary. I love you too. 6 months. While Richard had been accusing Margaret of adultery, he had been celebrating a 6-month anniversary with someone else. The timeline was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. Margaret saved the voicemail to her own phone and carefully returned Richard's hidden device to its place in his gym bag. She was learning that successful investigation required patience and planning, not emotional reactions. The rest of the afternoon was spent organizing her discoveries and deciding how to proceed. She had photographic evidence of domestic violence, documented proof of adultery, and financial records that showed Richard had been using their joint resources to fund his affair. But Margaret had been married to a corporate executive for 20 years. She knew that information was only powerful if you used it strategically. When Richard came home that evening, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing his favorite dinner as if nothing had changed. She had covered her bruise with makeup and arranged her expression into the neutral mask she had perfected over years of marriage. "How was your day?" she asked, handing him his usual cocktail. "Productive," Richard replied, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "Long meetings about the Hartford acquisition? Probably be working late again tomorrow night." "Of course," Margaret said. "I'll keep dinner warm." But as Richard settled into his evening routine, checking his phone and reviewing business documents, Margaret was conducting her own analysis. Every lie he told, every explanation he offered, every detail of his deception was being cataloged and remembered. The truth was about to reveal itself, and Margaret wasn't prepared for what she would discover next. That night, as Richard claimed he needed to return to the office for an emergency conference call, Margaret watched from the guest bedroom window as he drove away in the direction of downtown rather than his corporate campus. She waited exactly 1 hour, then called the hotel where Amanda had mentioned booking their usual room. "Good evening. Riverside Hotel," the desk clerk answered. "Hello," Margaret said, affecting a slightly southern accent. "I'm trying to reach my friend who's staying there tonight, Amanda Morrison. She asked me to call when I got into town." "I'm sorry," the clerk replied, "but we don't have any guests under that name currently registered." "Oh," Margaret said, thinking quickly. "Maybe she's registered under her boyfriend's name." "Richard Patterson." "Yes," the clerk confirmed. "Mr. Patterson checked in about an hour ago. Would you like me to connect you to his room?" "No, thank you," Margaret said. "I'll surprise them." She hung up the phone and sat in the dark guest bedroom, processing the confirmation of what she already knew. Richard was at a hotel with his mistress, while she sat at home, nursing bruises from his accusations of infidelity. The irony was so complete, it almost seemed scripted. Margaret opened her laptop and began researching divorce attorneys, focusing on lawyers who specialized in cases involving adultery and domestic violence. If Richard wanted to play games with their marriage, she would show him what a 53-year-old woman with nothing left to lose could accomplish. By midnight, she had compiled a list of potential legal representation and begun documenting a timeline of Richard's deception. The evidence was overwhelming, but Margaret knew she needed more than proof of adultery. She needed a strategy that would protect her financial future and ensure that Richard's pattern of narcissistic abuse never threatened another woman the way it had threatened her. The investigation was just beginning. Margaret woke before dawn, her internal clock disrupted by the adrenaline of discovery and the uncomfortable reality of sleeping alone in the guest bedroom. Through the window, she could see Tom Morrison already working in his garden, tending to his roses with the same patient care he brought to all his neighborly gestures. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Richard had been consumed with paranoid fantasies about her relationship with Tom, he had been conducting a very real affair with a woman half her age. Richard's phone buzzed from somewhere in the master bedroom, followed by his muffled cursing as he apparently struggled to answer it. Margaret heard fragments of his conversation through the walls. "Can't talk now. Later today." She doesn't suspect anything. The casual dismissal in his voice made her stomach clench. She doesn't suspect anything. 20 years of marriage reduced to a surveillance problem. His wife transformed from partner to obstacle. Margaret dressed carefully that morning, choosing a tailored blouse that would conceal her fading bruise but still look professional. If she was going to confront Richard with evidence of his affair, she wanted to project strength and composure, not victimhood. Richard was already downstairs when she entered the kitchen, dressed in his Navy power suit and scrolling through messages on his primary phone. He looked up when she approached, his expression guarded. "Sleep well?" he asked, but his tone suggested he didn't particularly care about her answer. "Fine," Margaret replied, beginning her morning coffee routine with mechanical precision. "You were on the phone early. Client crisis?" Richard said without elaboration. "Might need to work late again tonight." Margaret nodded, maintaining the facade of accepting his explanations at face value. "Of course. I'll plan accordingly." But as Richard gathered his briefcase and prepared to leave, Margaret made her decision. She couldn't continue this charade of normalcy while evidence of his betrayal was literally hidden in their bedroom closet. "Richard," she said as he headed toward the garage, "we need to talk when you get home tonight." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. About what? About us, Margaret said simply. About our marriage and where we go from here. Richard's face hardened. I thought we settled that discussion yesterday. You need to stop creating problems where none exist. The condescension in his voice sparked something fierce in Margaret's chest. Problems where none exist. You mean like the problem of you hitting your wife for accepting help from a neighbor? We're not doing this again. Margaret, Richard said, I don't have time for your emotional drama this morning. He left without another word, the garage door closing behind him with mechanical finality. But Margaret wasn't discouraged by his dismissal. She had work to do. After Richard's car disappeared down their street, Margaret retrieved his hidden phone from the gym bag. She had discovered yesterday that he rarely took both phones to work, apparently confident that his secret communications were secure in their bedroom closet. The phone showed several missed calls from Amanda, along with a voicemail that had been left after midnight. Margaret's pulse quickened as she accessed the message. Amanda's voice was young and sultry, with the slight southern accent Margaret had noticed in the text messages. Richard, sweetie, I can't wait to see you tonight. The hotel room is booked under your usual name. Wear that cologne I bought you for our 6-month anniversary. I love you too. Margaret listened to the voicemail 3 times, each repetition adding another layer of devastating clarity to her situation. 6 months of deception, a usual name at hotels, cologne purchased by another woman, anniversary celebrations that had nothing to do with their marriage. She saved the voicemail to her own phone and began scrolling through Richard's text message history with Amanda. The conversation was intimate, affectionate, and completely inconsistent with Richard's claims about working late and client emergencies. Amanda, miss you already. Last night was incredible. Richard can't stop thinking about you. This double life is getting exhausting, though. Amanda, I know. Baby. But soon we won't have to hide anymore. Richard, Margaret's starting to ask questions. We need to be more careful. Amanda. Maybe it's time to tell her about us. I'm ready to stop being your secret. Richard. Not yet. The timing has to be perfect. She could take half of everything in a divorce. The final message hit Margaret like a physical blow. She could take half of everything in a divorce. 20 years of marriage. And Richard's primary concern wasn't emotional devastation or broken trust, but financial liability. Margaret photographed the most damaging conversations and voicemails, then carefully returned the phone to its hiding place. The evidence was overwhelming, but she needed to present it strategically rather than reactively. The day passed slowly, with Margaret alternating between fury and heartbreak as she processed the full scope of Richard's betrayal. She called Linda for emotional support, researched divorce attorneys online, and began making practical plans for what felt like an inevitable separation. When Richard finally returned home that evening, Margaret was waiting in the living room with printouts of his hotel receipts and credit card statements spread across the coffee table. We need to have that conversation now, she said as he entered the room. Richard's eyes immediately went to the papers, his face cycling through surprise, anger, and calculation in rapid succession. What is this? He demanded. Documentation, Margaret replied calmly. Of your 6-month relationship with Amanda Morrison, your personal trainer, of hotel rooms charged to our joint credit card, of jewelry purchases for someone who isn't your wife? Richard's composure cracked slightly. You've been going through my private communications, your private communications. Margaret stood up, her voice remaining level despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Richard, we're married. We have joint accounts, shared credit cards, combined financial obligations. Nothing you do with our resources is entirely private. This is insane, Richard said, but his protest lacked conviction. You're turning into one of those paranoid wives who can't trust their husbands. Margaret reached for her phone and played Amanda's voicemail on speaker. Richard, sweetie, I can't wait to see you tonight. The hotel room is booked under your usual name. Wear that cologne I bought you for our 6-month anniversary. I love you too. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the phone as if Amanda's voice might somehow disappear if he concentrated hard enough. Funny, Margaret said when the voicemail ended. Because your personal trainer just left you a very intimate message about celebrating your 6-month anniversary while you were accusing me of having an affair with our neighbor? Richard's face flushed red, but instead of shame or apology, his expression hardened into defiance. You had no right to go through my private property, he said. Private property? Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Richard, you hit me yesterday for allegedly cheating with Tom Morrison. You called me a liar and suggested I was destroying your professional reputation. And now I find out you've been having an actual affair for 6 months. It's not what you think, Richard said, but the lie sounded hollow even to him. It's exactly what I think, Margaret replied. You've been cheating on me, using our money to fund your affair, and projecting your own guilt onto me by accusing me of infidelity. Richard began pacing, his corporate executive brain apparently searching for a way to control the narrative. Amanda is complicated, he said finally. She's young. She has unrealistic expectations about our relationship. I never promised her anything permanent. Our relationship, Margaret repeated. You mean your affair? It's not an affair, Richard snapped. It's a situation, a temporary arrangement that got more complicated than I intended. The casual cruelty of his language was breathtaking. Amanda wasn't a person with feelings in Richard's analysis, just a situation that had become inconvenient. Listen to yourself, Margaret said. You're talking about a human being like she's a business problem you need to solve. Because that's exactly what she is, Richard replied, his mask finally slipping completely. A problem that I've been managing while trying to maintain stability at home. Margaret stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in their marriage. Not the ambitious but caring man she had fallen in love with, but a narcissistic manipulator who viewed both his wife and his mistress as objects to be managed rather than people to be respected. I'm sleeping in the guest room again tonight, she said, gathering the printed evidence from the coffee table. We're not finished with this conversation. Richard called after her. Yes, we are, Margaret replied without turning around. Until you can have an honest discussion about what you've done to our marriage, we have nothing to talk about. As she climbed the stairs to the guest bedroom, Margaret heard Richard on the phone, his voice low and urgent, probably calling Amanda to warn her that his wife had discovered their secret. But Margaret was no longer interested in Richard's damage control strategies. She had all the evidence she needed to prove adultery, and Richard's reaction had shown her exactly how little remorse he felt about betraying their marriage vows. Tomorrow, she would begin making calls to the divorce attorneys on her list. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully for the first time in months, no longer wondering if she was paranoid or oversensitive. The truth had finally revealed itself, and Margaret was ready to act on what she had learned. Margaret spent the following morning researching divorce attorneys, while Richard attended what she now knew were probably fictional business meetings. She had crossed a threshold overnight, moving from evidence gathering to action planning, and the shift felt both terrifying and liberating. Linda called just after lunch, her voice full of sisterly concern. How are you holding up, she asked. Better than expected, Margaret replied, surprising herself with the honesty of that statement. Finding out the truth is awful, but not knowing was worse. What's your next step? I'm going to follow him tonight, Margaret said, the words coming out before she had fully formed the plan. He claims he's staying at his brother's house until I come to my senses, but I think he's going to the hotel where he meets Amanda. Linda was quiet for a moment. Are you sure you want to see that sometimes ignorance really is bliss? I need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with, Margaret said. For 20 years, I've been making decisions based on incomplete information. Not anymore. That evening, Richard made a show of packing a small suitcase while delivering a lecture about Margaret's unreasonable behavior and his need for space to think clearly about their marriage. Maybe some time apart will help you realize how good you've had it here, he said, loading his bag into his BMW. I'll be staying at David's place until you're ready to have a rational conversation. Margaret nodded appropriately and wished him well. But as soon as his taillights disappeared down their street, she was grabbing her keys and following at a safe distance. Richard's BMW took the highway toward downtown Hartford, nowhere near his brother David's suburban home. Margaret felt a grim satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed so quickly and completely. She followed him to the same Riverside hotel where she had called the previous night, watching from the parking lot as he entered the lobby with the confidence of a regular guest. Margaret waited 15 minutes, then parked her car and entered through the side entrance. The hotel bar was dimly lit and sparsely populated, perfect for a woman who needed to observe without being noticed. Margaret chose a corner table, ordered a glass of wine, and settled in to wait. She didn't have to wait long. Richard appeared in the bar entrance, now dressed in casual clothes rather than his business suit. He was accompanied by a young blonde woman whom Margaret recognized immediately from the photos on his hidden phone. Amanda was everything Margaret had expected and dreaded. 20-something, fit, beautiful in the effortless way that only came with youth. She wore a red dress that Margaret could never have pulled off, and she looked at Richard with obvious adoration. Have you ever sat in a hotel bar at 10 o'clock at night, watching your entire life crumble through the bottom of a wine glass? Margaret thought, taking a sip of her Chardonnay and trying to look like any other business traveler unwinding after a long day. Richard and Amanda settled into a booth across the room, close enough for Margaret to hear fragments of their conversation, but far enough away to avoid recognition. Margaret had worn dark glasses and pulled her hair back, hoping to blend into the anonymous crowd of hotel guests. She's getting suspicious, Richard was saying, his voice carrying across the dimly lit space. We need to be more careful about our timing. Amanda leaned forward, her southern accent more pronounced in person than it had been on the voicemail. Maybe it's time to tell her, Richard, I'm tired of being your secret. Richard's response was swift and sharp. Are you crazy she'd take half of everything in the divorce? The company, the house, the investments? I've worked too hard to hand it over to someone who hasn't contributed a dime. Margaret felt the words hit her like a physical assault. Someone who hasn't contributed a dime. 20 years of supporting his career, hosting his business dinners, managing his household, raising his professional profile in the community, and Richard saw her contribution as worthless. But honey, Amanda continued, you said yourself that she's not the same woman you married. Maybe she'd be happier too if you both just moved on. Richard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Margaret doesn't have the backbone to ask for a divorce. She's too comfortable with the lifestyle I've provided, too scared to make it on her own. Margaret's hand tightened around her wine glass as she listened to her husband reduce their entire marriage to a financial transaction and her personality to cowardice. Besides, Richard continued, if we play this right, she'll be the one who looks unreasonable. All that paranoid behavior, accusing me of things I'm not doing, making scenes about innocent interactions with neighbors. I could probably get sole custody of the assets if I document her instability correctly. The calculation in his voice was breathtaking. Richard wasn't just cheating on her. He was actively strategizing to portray her as mentally unstable so he could avoid the financial consequences of adultery. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't like the idea of hurting her. Richard, she seems like a nice woman from what you've told me. Nice women finish last in divorce court. Richard replied, trust me, I've seen how these things play out. The key is controlling the narrative from the beginning. Margaret had heard enough. She left money on the table for her wine and walked out of the hotel bar, her mind reeling from the casual cruelty of Richard's planning. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for several minutes, processing what she had witnessed. Richard wasn't just unfaithful. He was actively plotting to destroy her reputation and financial security to avoid the consequences of his own behavior. The man she had been married to for 20 years had just revealed himself to be a stranger who saw her as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a person deserving of basic respect. Margaret started her car and drove home, but instead of feeling devastated, she found herself getting angry, really, truly angry for the first time in years. Richard thought she was too comfortable and too scared to fight for herself. He was counting on her passivity, her conflict avoidance, her 20-year pattern of choosing peace over confrontation. He was about to discover how wrong he could be. At home, Margaret poured herself another glass of wine and called Linda. "I need the name of the best divorce attorney in Connecticut," she said when her sister answered. "Did something happen?" Linda asked. "Richard just showed me exactly who he really is," Margaret replied. "And it turns out I'm married to someone I've never met before." She explained what she had overheard at the hotel, Richard's casual dismissal of her contributions to their marriage, and his plan to portray her as unstable to avoid paying appropriate settlement. "The bastard," Linda said when Margaret finished. "What are you going to do? I'm going to show him what a 53-year-old woman with nothing left to lose can accomplish." Margaret replied, "He wants to play games with our marriage." "Fine, but he's about to learn that I've been watching him for 20 years, and I know exactly how to win games he doesn't even realize we're playing." By midnight, Margaret had compiled a comprehensive file of evidence, including photographs of her bruised face, printouts of Richard's affair-related expenses, recordings of Amanda's voicemails, and detailed notes about the conversation she had overheard at the hotel. Richard returned home the next morning, apparently expecting to find her chastened and apologetic after his night of strategic absence. Instead, he found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with divorce papers already drafted by Connecticut's most aggressive family law attorney. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice pleasantly calm. "Your coffee is ready, and so am I." The war for her financial independence after 50 was about to begin, and Margaret had every intention of winning. Margaret spent the next week in a state of focused preparation that would have impressed any corporate strategist. She documented Richard's affair with forensic precision, consulted with Sarah Chen, Connecticut's most feared divorce attorney, and began building a network of women supporting women that would have made her mother proud. Linda flew in from California, arriving with legal documents, moral support, and a fierce determination to see her sister reclaim her dignity. Jennifer, Margaret's college friend who had become a successful private investigator, provided professional expertise in evidence gathering. Even Tom Morrison, the neighbor whose innocent helpfulness had triggered Richard's paranoid accusations, offered practical assistance and emotional support. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was both elegant and devastating. Richard had mentioned during one of his fake phone calls that he would be dining at Chez Laurent on Friday night, allegedly entertaining potential investors for the Hartford acquisition. Margaret knew from her surveillance that Amanda would be joining him for what they probably considered a romantic evening at Hartford's most exclusive restaurant. What Richard didn't know was that Margaret had also made reservations at Chez Laurent for the same evening. Margaret dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a black cocktail dress that projected confidence and sophistication. She wanted to look like the successful woman she had been before marriage reduced her to Richard's supporting cast, the interior design graduate who had sacrificed her own ambitions to build his career. Tom Morrison arrived at 7:30, wearing a navy suit that complemented Margaret's ensemble perfectly. In the 3 weeks since Richard's accusations about their alleged affair, Tom had proven himself to be exactly what he appeared, a kind, divorced man who understood the pain of marital betrayal and wanted to help a neighbor in crisis. "You don't have to do this," he said as they drove toward the restaurant. Confronting him publicly could backfire. Margaret adjusted her rearview mirror to check her makeup one final time. "Tom, for 20 years I've avoided conflict to preserve a marriage that was already over. Tonight, I'm choosing truth over peacekeeping." Chez Laurent was everything Margaret remembered from the early years of her marriage, when she and Richard had celebrated promotions and anniversaries in its candlelit dining room. The maitre d' recognized her immediately, seating her and Tom at a prime table with clear sight lines to the rest of the restaurant. They didn't have to wait long. Richard entered at 8:15, looking confident and relaxed in his charcoal suit. Amanda was radiant beside him, wearing a red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. They were seated at Richard's usual table, where he had apparently been conducting his affair in plain sight for months. Margaret watched her husband through the flickering candlelight, noting how different he looked with Amanda than he had with her in recent years. Attentive, charming, genuinely engaged in conversation. This was the Richard she had fallen in love with 20 years ago. The man who had disappeared gradually over their marriage until she began to wonder if she had imagined his capacity for warmth and affection. Now she understood. Richard was still capable of charm and attention. He had simply decided she no longer deserved either. "I still can't believe he slapped you," Tom said quietly, cutting into his salmon with precise movements. "My ex-wife never laid a hand on me, even during our worst fights." Margaret appreciated Tom's steady presence, his genuine outrage on her behalf, his complete lack of romantic pressure despite their unusual circumstances. He was everything Richard had accused him of being, except that he was offering friendship and support rather than seduction. "The narcissistic abuse was probably going on for years," Margaret replied, remembering her research into the patterns of emotional manipulation. "I just didn't recognize it because it was so gradual." They finished their appetizers while keeping discreet watch on Richard's table. Margaret noted how he touched Amanda's hand, how he leaned in to hear her conversation, how he smiled with genuine pleasure at whatever she was saying. When their entrees arrived, Margaret made her decision. "Wish me luck," she said to Tom, rising from her chair with the poise she had perfected during decades of corporate dinner parties. Margaret crossed the restaurant dining room like a woman who owned the space, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. Other diners glanced up as she passed, recognizing the electricity that preceded dramatic confrontations. She arrived at Richard's table just as he was raising a glass of expensive wine to toast whatever anniversary or milestone he was celebrating with his mistress. "Richard, darling," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the intimate restaurant atmosphere. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your dining companion?" Richard's wine glass froze halfway to his lips. His face cycled through shock, panic, and fury in rapid succession before settling into the cold calculation Margaret had learned to recognize as his default mode under pressure. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What are you doing here?" "Having dinner with a friend," Margaret replied pleasantly, gesturing toward Tom, who was watching from their table. "You remember Tom Morrison, don't you? Our neighbor whom you accused me of having an affair with Amanda," looked between Margaret and Richard with growing confusion, clearly trying to process the sudden appearance of the wife she had probably been told was unreasonable and unstable. "Richard, who is this?" Amanda asked, her southern accent more pronounced under stress. Margaret smiled warmly at the younger woman. "I'm Margaret Patterson, Richard's wife of 20 years. And you must be Amanda, his personal trainer." "Personal trainer." Amanda's voice rose slightly. "Richard, you told me you were separated." The lie hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Other diners were beginning to notice the commotion, their conversations quieting as they sensed drama unfolding at the prominent corner table. Separated. Margaret's laugh was genuinely amused. "That's interesting. Amanda, we shared a bed 3 nights ago. Well, before Richard moved into the guest room after slapping me for allegedly cheating with Tom." The restaurant fell completely silent. Amanda's face drained of color as she processed Margaret's words. "You slapped her?" Amanda turned to Richard, her voice trembling with shock and disgust. "You told me she was emotionally abusive, that she was the one who got physical." Richard's careful facade crumbled completely. He looked around the restaurant, realizing that his professional reputation was being destroyed in real time by witnesses who would remember this confrontation for years. "Margaret, you're making a scene," he hissed. "These people don't need to hear our personal business." "Personal business," Margaret's voice remained perfectly controlled, but it carried to every corner of the now silent dining room. "Richard, when you use our joint credit cards to fund hotel rooms for your affairs, when you lie to both your wife and your mistress about the nature of your relationships, when you hit your spouse for imaginary infidelity while conducting very real adultery, it stops being personal business." Amanda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking. "Richard, you lied to me about everything. Your marriage, your separation, your wife's behavior. Everything." "Amanda, wait," Richard called, but she was already walking toward the restaurant exit, her red dress a blur of movement and betrayal. The maitre d' approached their table with professional discretion. "Perhaps we could resolve this matter more privately," he suggested. "Of course," Margaret said graciously. "Richard, I believe your dinner companion has left. Tom and I will finish our meal and let you process whatever just happened here." She turned and walked back to her table with the same confidence she had displayed approaching Richard's, leaving her husband sitting alone among the ruins of his carefully constructed double life. The restaurant slowly returned to normal conversation levels, but Margaret could feel the weight of attention and speculation following her across the dining room. By tomorrow, Richard's colleagues and clients would all know about his affair, his lies, and his domestic violence. His professional reputation, which he had prioritized above everything else in their marriage, was now as damaged as their relationship. "How do you feel?" Tom asked as Margaret settled back into her chair. "Free," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the honesty of that single word. "For the first time in 20 years, I feel completely free." They finished their dinner in companionable conversation while Richard sat alone at his table, staring at his untouched meal and presumably contemplating the complete destruction of his carefully managed image. When they left the restaurant, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The public confrontation had been risky, but it had accomplished exactly what she had hoped. It had forced Richard to face consequences for his behavior in front of the professional community he valued more than his marriage. Tomorrow, the real work of building her new life would begin. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully, knowing that she had finally stopped accepting lies as truth and cowardice as wisdom. The war for her midlife transformation was far from over, but Margaret had just won the most important battle, the fight for her own self-respect. The morning after the restaurant confrontation, Margaret woke with the clarity that only comes after surviving your worst fear. She had been terrified of public humiliation, of social ostracism, of being seen as a bitter woman who couldn't hold her marriage together. Instead, she had discovered that truth was its own form of armor. Her phone had been buzzing since dawn with messages from women she barely knew, wives of Richard's colleagues who had witnessed the scene at Chez Laurent and wanted to offer support. "Margaret, I don't know you well, but what happened last night took incredible courage. If you need anything, please call Jennifer Walsh, wife of Richard's business partner. I've suspected my husband of similar behavior for months. Would you be willing to share the name of your attorney? Susan Chen, no relation to Margaret's lawyer, but clearly dealing with her own marital crisis." The messages continued throughout the morning, creating an unexpected network of women supporting women that Margaret had never anticipated. Apparently, Richard's behavior was neither unique nor particularly well hidden among the corporate wives of Hartford's business community. Margaret spent the morning organizing her evidence with the methodical precision she had learned during 20 years of managing Richard's household and career obligations. Bank statements, credit card records, hotel receipts, photographs of her bruised face, recordings of Amanda's voicemails, and detailed notes about every lie Richard had told over the past 6 months. Linda arrived just after lunch, carrying coffee and legal documents from Sarah Chen's office. "The divorce papers are ready," she announced, settling into Margaret's kitchen with the take-charge attitude that had made her successful in California's competitive marketing industry. "Sarah says you have enough evidence to demand significant alimony and asset division." Margaret reviewed the paperwork, noting how her 20-year marriage was being reduced to financial calculations and legal terminology. Community property, spousal support, asset liquidation, custody arrangements for their joint investments. "What about Richard's reaction to last night?" Linda asked. "He sent me 12 text messages between midnight and 6 this morning," Margaret replied, showing Linda her phone. Threats, promises, apologies, and accusations. The full cycle of narcissistic abuse, all documented in writing. Linda scrolled through Richard's messages, her expression growing darker with each desperate communication. "Richard, you've destroyed my professional reputation for no reason. Richard, Amanda means nothing to me. You're the only woman I've ever really loved. Richard, If you continue this vindictive behavior, I'll make sure you get nothing in the divorce. Richard, I'm willing to work on our marriage if you can be reasonable about what happened. Richard, you're acting like a crazy person. Everyone at the restaurant thinks you've lost your mind. Richard, please call me. We can fix this if we work together. This is textbook manipulation, Linda said when she finished reading. Threats followed by love bombing, followed by gaslighting. He's completely predictable. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief at having Richard's behavior patterns validated by someone who understood psychological manipulation. For 20 years, she had questioned her own perceptions, wondered if she was being too sensitive or unreasonable in her expectations. Now she could see that Richard's behavior followed established patterns of emotional abuse that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with his character. Jennifer Morrison arrived that afternoon, carrying files and laptop equipment that suggested her private investigation business was more sophisticated than Margaret had realized. I've been doing some research on Richard's financial activities, Jennifer announced, spreading documents across Margaret's dining room table. The affair with Amanda is just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret and Linda listened as Jennifer outlined her discoveries. Richard had been moving money into offshore accounts for over 2 years, apparently preparing for a potential divorce long before Margaret had any suspicion of problems in their marriage. He's been systematically undervaluing the company's worth while transferring personal assets to accounts in the Cayman Islands, Jennifer explained. Classic preparation for hiding wealth during divorce proceedings. The revelation was staggering. While Margaret had been focused on saving their marriage, Richard had been planning its dissolution and ensuring that she would receive as little financial support as possible. There's more, Jennifer continued. Amanda isn't his first affair. I've found evidence of at least 3 other relationships over the past 5 years, a pattern of short-term liaisons with younger women, all conducted with the same level of secrecy and financial expenditure. Margaret stared at the evidence spread across her dining room table, realizing that her entire marriage had been built on foundations of deception she had never suspected. Richard hadn't just betrayed her recently. He had been systematically unfaithful for years while she supported his career and maintained their household. The man she thought she knew had never existed. How did I miss this? Margaret asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of Richard's duplicity. Because you trusted him, Linda said firmly. Because you were focused on being a good wife instead of being a suspicious investigator. Because normal people don't assume their spouses are conducting multiple affairs while hiding assets in offshore accounts. Jennifer began organizing the financial documents into categories that would be useful for divorce proceedings. Richard's pattern of behavior was so extensive and well documented that Margaret's attorney would have overwhelming evidence of adultery, financial fraud, and systematic deception. He made one crucial mistake, Jennifer observed. He kept records of everything. Email confirmations for hotel bookings, credit card statements for jewelry purchases, bank transfers to hidden accounts. Richard documented his own crimes because he never thought you'd be smart enough or motivated enough to investigate him. The condescension implicit in Richard's record-keeping was almost as insulting as his actual infidelity. He had been so confident in Margaret's passivity, so certain of her financial dependence and emotional vulnerability, that he hadn't bothered to cover his tracks effectively. That evening, Margaret called Sarah Chen to schedule an emergency meeting. The evidence Jennifer had uncovered transformed their divorce case from simple adultery to potential criminal fraud, and Margaret wanted to understand all her legal options. You have enough documentation to request forensic accounting of all your husband's business and personal finances, Sarah explained during their phone conversation. The offshore accounts alone could constitute criminal tax evasion, and using marital assets to conduct affairs gives you grounds for significant punitive damages. Margaret found herself thinking about financial independence after 50 in concrete terms for the first time in her adult life. Not as a theoretical concept, but as an achievable reality that might actually provide more security than her marriage ever had. Richard came home that night to find Margaret sitting in his home office, surrounded by evidence of his secret life, bank statements, hotel receipts, photographs of Amanda and other women, documentation of hidden assets and fraudulent tax reporting. What is this, he demanded. But his voice lacked the authority he had wielded so effectively throughout their marriage. This is the truth, Margaret replied calmly, about your affairs, your financial fraud, your systematic deception of both your wife and the Internal Revenue Service. Richard's face went pale as he recognized documents he thought were securely hidden. You've been in my private files. Richard, Margaret said, standing up from his desk chair. We don't have private files anymore. We have evidence for divorce proceedings and potentially criminal prosecution. She handed him a copy of the divorce papers, watching as he read through the extensive list of assets, debts, and demands for spousal support. You can't be serious, Richard said, but his voice was shaking. This is vindictive, cruel. You're trying to destroy my entire life. No, Margaret replied. I'm trying to rebuild mine. You destroyed your own life when you decided that marriage vows were optional and financial honesty was unnecessary. Richard sank into the chair across from his desk, apparently realizing for the first time that his carefully constructed double life was collapsing around him. What do you want? He asked quietly. I want a divorce settlement that reflects my contributions to your career and compensates me for 20 years of supporting a man who was systematically betraying me. Margaret said, I want financial security that doesn't depend on your honesty or fidelity. And I want you to understand that underestimating women can be a very expensive mistake. Margaret left Richard sitting in his office, surrounded by evidence of his own deception, and went upstairs to the guest bedroom that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow, she would begin building a life based on truth rather than illusion, on her own strength rather than someone else's promises. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret fell asleep planning her own future instead of managing someone else's expectations. Margaret had never been inside the gleaming downtown Hartford offices of Patterson Financial Group. Despite the fact that her husband's name was literally on the building directory, for 20 years, she had been told that corporate spaces were Richard's domain, that wives were appreciated at company parties but unnecessary in actual business settings. Today, she was about to discover exactly how much power a wronged wife could wield in those same corporate spaces. Sarah Chen walked beside her through the marble lobby, both women dressed in their most authoritative business attire. Margaret wore a navy suit that projected competence and resolve, while Sarah carried a briefcase containing enough evidence to destroy Richard's career and potentially land him in federal prison. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the 32nd floor conference room, where Richard would be presenting quarterly projections to the company's investors and board members. Margaret had timed their arrival perfectly, waiting until Richard would be deep into his presentation and unable to control the narrative. Jennifer Morrison had provided the final pieces of evidence, just that morning documentation, showing that Richard had been using company funds to finance his affairs, charging personal expenses to corporate accounts, and manipulating financial reports to hide his fraudulent activity. The elevator rose smoothly toward the executive floors, giving Margaret time to review her strategy. She wasn't here for revenge, though she wouldn't deny that justice felt satisfying. She was here to ensure that Richard faced consequences for his behavior and that other women wouldn't suffer the same deception and abuse she had endured. The conference room doors were impressive, solid oak with brass fittings that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. Margaret could hear Richard's voice through the wood, confident and persuasive as he explained market projections and acquisition strategies to investors who trusted him with millions of dollars. Ready? Sarah asked, her hand on the door handle. Margaret nodded, thinking about all the women who had reached out to her since the restaurant confrontation. Wives who suspected their own husbands of similar behavior, daughters who wanted to see their mothers treated with dignity, friends who understood that silence in the face of abuse protected no one. They entered the conference room during the middle of Richard's presentation. 12 board members and investors looked up as Margaret and Sarah walked purposefully toward the head of the massive mahogany table, where Richard stood frozen beside his PowerPoint presentation. I apologize for the interruption. Gentlemen, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I'm Margaret Patterson, Richard's wife of 20 years. I have information relevant to the company's financial integrity that requires immediate attention. Richard's face went through several color changes as he processed the complete destruction of his carefully maintained professional image. Margaret, he said, his voice tight with panic. This is neither the time nor the place for personal discussions. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her legal credentials commanding immediate respect from the business-minded audience. Mr. Patterson has been using company funds for personal affairs, including hotel rooms, jewelry purchases, and vacation trips with his mistress. She announced with prosecutorial precision, this constitutes fraud and embezzlement of corporate resources. The silence in the room was absolute. Board Chairman William Foster, a man Margaret recognized from countless corporate Christmas parties, leaned forward with obvious concern. These are serious allegations, he said. Can you provide documentation? Sarah opened her briefcase and began distributing copies of credit card statements, expense reports, and bank transfers. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized, showing a clear pattern of Richard using corporate accounts for personal expenses related to his affair. Richard tried to regain control of the situation. Margaret is a scorned wife trying to destroy my career, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Don't let personal drama affect business decisions. Personal drama. Margaret's laugh was genuinely incredulous. Richard, when you charge hotel rooms to the company credit card so you can conduct affairs with employees, when you manipulate expense reports to hide fraudulent spending, when you use corporate resources to purchase gifts for your mistress, it stops being personal drama and becomes criminal fraud. She gestured toward the presentation screen, where Richard's quarterly projections were still displayed. I spent 20 years supporting this man's career, hosting his business dinners, managing his professional image, building relationships with the clients and investors in this room. Margaret continued, I believed I was partnering with someone who shared my values of honesty and integrity. Instead, I was unknowingly enabling someone who sees rules and ethics as obstacles to his personal gratification. Sarah began reading specific examples from the evidence file. Hotel charges to corporate accounts corresponding with Richard's affair timeline. Jewelry purchases expensed as client gifts but delivered to Amanda's address. Vacation trips charged as business conferences but spent entirely with his mistress. Board member Patricia Walsh, one of the few women in the room, spoke up with obvious anger. Richard, you've been representing this company to clients and investors while conducting yourself in a manner that could expose us to criminal liability. Richard made one final attempt to deflect responsibility. Amanda is a personal trainer who occasionally provides services to company executives. Any expenses related to her work are legitimate business costs. Margaret reached into her purse and placed Richard's hidden phone on the conference table. The device contained months of intimate text messages, photographs, and voicemails that left no doubt about the nature of his relationship with Amanda. Would you like me to play some of the voicemails Amanda left on this phone? Margaret asked. The ones where she talks about celebrating your 6-month anniversary in hotel rooms charged to company accounts? Richard's composure collapsed entirely. Several board members were already making notes, obviously calculating the legal and financial implications of employing someone who had committed fraud using corporate resources. There's more, Sarah announced, distributing another set of documents. Mr. Patterson has been systematically hiding assets in offshore accounts, underreporting company valuations, and manipulating financial records in ways that could constitute tax evasion and securities fraud. William Foster stood up, his face grim with the recognition that Richard's personal misconduct had created massive liability for everyone in the room. Richard, you're suspended from all duties effective immediately, he announced. Security will escort you from the building while we conduct a full audit of your financial activities. Richard looked around the conference table, apparently hoping to find support from colleagues who had worked with him for years. Instead, he saw the cold calculation of business professionals who understood that his behavior threatened their own financial interests. You're making a mistake, Richard said desperately. I've built this company, brought in millions of dollars in revenue, created value for every investor in this room. You've also created criminal liability for every person at this table. Patricia Walsh replied sharply. Your personal conduct has compromised our professional integrity and exposed us to prosecution for crimes we didn't commit. Margaret watched as security officers entered the conference room, clearly summoned by someone during the presentation of evidence. Richard's corporate empire was collapsing with the same efficiency he had once brought to business negotiations. Mrs. Patterson, William Foster said as Richard was escorted toward the elevator, the board appreciates your courage in bringing this information to our attention. We'll be conducting a comprehensive investigation and cooperating fully with law enforcement. Margaret nodded graciously, feeling a sense of completion that surprised her with its intensity. For 20 years, she had supported Richard's career while he systematically betrayed her trust and violated the law. Now, finally, he was facing consequences that matched the scope of his deception. As the elevator doors closed behind Richard and his security escort, Margaret realized that her midlife transformation was complete. She was no longer the submissive wife who accepted explanations without evidence, who chose peace over justice, who prioritized her husband's comfort over her own dignity. She was a woman who had reclaimed her power and used it to protect herself and other women from a man who saw marriage vows and business ethics as optional conveniences. The war for her financial independence after 50 had been won in a corporate conference room, witnessed by the same business community that Richard had valued above everything else in their marriage. Margaret left the Patterson Financial Group building, knowing she would never return, and feeling grateful for that certainty. 6 weeks after the board meeting that ended Richard's career, Margaret's house had been transformed from a shrine to corporate success into a warm home where friends gathered to celebrate justice and new beginnings. The crystal stemware, an imported coffee service, had been replaced by comfortable furniture and fresh flowers from Tom's garden. Linda had extended her stay indefinitely, working remotely from California while providing emotional support and practical assistance with legal proceedings. Jennifer Morrison had become a close friend, in addition to a professional ally, bringing over Chinese takeout and divorce war stories that made Margaret laugh instead of cry. Tonight, they were joined by Sarah Chen, who had arrived with champagne and news that would change Margaret's life forever. The divorce settlement is finalized, Sarah announced, raising her glass in the living room that Margaret had redecorated in warm yellows and soft blues. Congratulations, Margaret. You're officially a free woman with a very secure financial future. Margaret listened as Sarah outlined the terms of her victory. 50% of all marital assets, including the previously hidden offshore accounts that Richard had hoped to conceal. Alimony payments for 15 years, calculated based on Margaret's contributions to Richard's career advancement. Full ownership of their Connecticut home, which Richard would be required to sign over within 30 days. What about Richard's legal situation, Linda asked. Sarah's smile was professionally satisfied. The SEC investigation is ongoing, but Richard has already been charged with securities fraud and tax evasion. He's also facing civil lawsuits from company investors who lost money due to his financial manipulation. Jennifer pulled out her laptop and showed them recent news articles about the Patterson Financial Group scandal. Richard's professional downfall had been swift and comprehensive, with federal prosecutors treating his case as an example of corporate fraud that victimized both investors and employees. He's living in a studio apartment in West Hartford, Jennifer reported. Amanda left him immediately after learning about his other affairs and the criminal charges. His brother David won't speak to him because the family reputation has been damaged by association. Margaret felt no satisfaction in Richard's complete social and professional destruction, but she did feel relief that he was finally facing consequences that matched his behavior. I spent 20 years being the perfect corporate wife, Margaret said, looking around at the women who had helped her reclaim her life. I hosted dinner parties and remembered clients' names and managed Richard's image while he systematically betrayed every value I thought we shared. But you know what I realized, she continued. I didn't lose 20 years. I gained 20 years of experience in organization, negotiation, relationship management, and strategic planning, skills that I'm going to use to build something that actually belongs to me. Margaret had enrolled in interior design classes at the University of Hartford, rediscovering the passion she had abandoned when she married Richard. Her professors were impressed by her natural talent and her mature perspective on creating spaces that reflected people's authentic selves rather than their aspirations for social status. Several of the women who had reached out after the restaurant confrontation had asked Margaret to redesign their homes, creating an unexpected client base for the interior design business she was planning to launch. Tom Morrison had become a steady presence in her life, offering friendship and emotional support without romantic pressure. His own divorce had taught him the value of patience and genuine connection, qualities that Richard had never demonstrated during their marriage. "We're thinking about taking a trip to Italy next month," Margaret announced, surprising herself with how natural the statement sounded. "Tom has always wanted to see the gardens of Tuscany, and I'd love to study Italian interior design techniques." The idea of traveling with a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than a supporting cast member felt revolutionary after 20 years of marriage to someone who had reduced her to a household manager and public accessory. "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Linda said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of how you've handled this entire situation." Margaret reflected on the journey from that morning coffee ritual 6 months ago to this celebration of independence and justice. The woman who had accepted lipstick stains and late meetings without question had become someone who demanded evidence and accountability from everyone in her life. "The most valuable lesson I learned," Margaret said, "is that when someone tries to diminish your worth, they're usually revealing their own insecurities. Richard spent our entire marriage trying to make me smaller because he was threatened by my potential for independence." She paused, thinking about all the women who were still trapped in relationships similar to what hers had been. A confident, secure person doesn't need to tear others down to feel powerful. She continued, "Richard's need to control and manipulate me was never about my behavior. It was always about his fear that I might realize I didn't need him as much as he needed me to believe I did." Sarah Chen raised her champagne glass again. "To Margaret Patterson, who proved that women supporting women can accomplish anything." The toast was echoed by everyone in the room. But Margaret was thinking about the broader implications of her victory. Richard's behavior hadn't existed in isolation. It was part of a pattern of narcissistic abuse that damaged women across social and economic boundaries. "I want to help other women recognize these patterns before they waste 20 years of their lives," Margaret said. "I'm thinking about starting a support group for women going through similar situations." The idea had been forming in her mind for weeks. Inspired by the messages she continued to receive from women who had witnessed her public confrontation with Richard or heard about her successful divorce settlement through Hartford's social networks, Jennifer leaned forward with obvious interest. "I could provide investigative services for women who suspect their husbands of financial fraud or adultery. A lot of them don't know how to gather evidence effectively, and I could handle the legal referrals," Sarah added. "There are attorneys who specialize in high-asset divorces involving narcissistic abuse, but most women don't know how to find them." Margaret felt the excitement of purposeful collaboration, the same energy she had brought to supporting Richard's career, but directed toward causes that aligned with her own values. "We could call it Phoenix Rising," Linda suggested. "Women who are rebuilding their lives from the ashes of bad marriages." The name resonated immediately. Margaret had always thought of herself as someone who avoided conflict, but she was learning that there was a difference between avoiding unnecessary drama and refusing to fight for justice. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tom. "Dinner ready when you are. No pressure if you want to stay with the girls longer." The casual consideration in his message highlighted everything that had been missing from her marriage to Richard. Tom never demanded her attention or made her feel guilty for having independent friendships. He supported her relationships with other women because he understood that strong partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than emotional dependence. "I should probably head home," Margaret said, using the word that still felt new and empowering. "Tom is making his famous pasta sauce, and I promised to bring wine." As her friends began gathering their belongings, Margaret realized how much her definition of home had changed. It was no longer the pristine showcase of Richard's success, with every surface designed to impress visitors and business associates. Home was now a place where she could be authentically herself, where friends felt comfortable putting their feet up on the furniture, where laughter was more important than appearances, where every decision reflected her own preferences rather than someone else's expectations. The doorbell rang as everyone was preparing to leave, and Margaret opened it to find a delivery person holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. "Margaret Patterson," the young man asked. "That's me," Margaret replied, accepting the arrangement of roses, lilies, and baby's breath that would have cost several $100s at Hartford's premium florist. The card was from Richard, with a message that made everyone in the room roll their eyes. "Margaret, I've had time to think about our situation, and I'm willing to forgive your vindictive behavior if you're ready to work on rebuilding our marriage. We can put this unfortunate episode behind us and return to the life we built together. I love you." "Richard," Margaret read the message aloud, and the room erupted in laughter that held no malice but plenty of disbelief. "He still doesn't get it," Jennifer observed. "He thinks this is something you did to him rather than consequences for his own choices." Margaret carried the expensive flowers to her kitchen and dropped them directly into the garbage disposal. The gesture felt symbolic and satisfying, a physical representation of her refusal to accept Richard's attempts to rewrite history or minimize his responsibility for destroying their marriage. "That's the most expensive garbage I've ever seen," Linda commented, but her tone was approving. "Some things aren't worth recycling," Margaret replied, turning on the disposal and watching 20 years of accepting Richard's manipulative gestures disappear down the drain. Her friends left with promises to meet again soon for Phoenix Rising planning sessions, and Margaret walked across her backyard to Tom's house, carrying a bottle of wine and feeling lighter than she had in decades. Tom's kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and he greeted her with a hug that was warm without being possessive, affectionate without being demanding. "How did the celebration go?" he asked, stirring sauce while she opened the wine. "Perfect," Margaret replied. "Sarah says the divorce settlement will give me complete financial independence. I can start my interior design business without worrying about immediate profitability." Tom raised his wine glass in a toast to new beginnings and second chances. As they sat down to dinner in Tom's comfortable kitchen, Margaret reflected on how different this felt from the formal dining experiences she had shared with Richard. There was no performance required, no need to manage conversation topics or worry about making the right impression. Tom asked about her design classes and listened genuinely to her ideas about starting Phoenix Rising. He shared stories about his own post-divorce journey and the lessons he had learned about rebuilding life after betrayal. The conversation flowed naturally from serious topics to silly observations, from future plans to childhood memories, from professional ambitions to personal dreams. When Margaret finally returned to her own house that evening, she felt the deep satisfaction of a day well lived and a future full of possibilities. She had started the morning as a woman celebrating her victory over an abusive husband and ended it as someone planning to help other women achieve their own liberation. The transformation from victim to victor to advocate felt like the natural progression of a journey that had begun with a single slap and evolved into a comprehensive reclamation of personal power. Margaret fell asleep that night in her own bed, in her own house, surrounded by her own choices, planning her own future. For the first time in 20 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The morning sunlight streamed through Margaret's redesigned kitchen windows, illuminating the warm yellow walls and comfortable breakfast nook that had replaced the cold marble surfaces of her previous life. She sat at her antique pine table, reviewing design proposals for 3 new clients while sipping coffee that was perfectly suited to her own taste rather than anyone else's preferences. Phoenix Rising had become more successful than any of them had anticipated. What had started as an informal support group for women escaping difficult marriages had evolved into a comprehensive resource network offering legal referrals, investigative services, career counseling, and emotional support. Margaret's interior design business was thriving as well, with clients drawn to her philosophy of creating spaces that reflected authentic personalities rather than social aspirations. Women who were rebuilding their lives after divorce particularly appreciated her understanding of the difference between a house designed for display and a home designed for living. Her phone rang as she was reviewing fabric samples for a client who wanted to transform her former marital bedroom into a personal sanctuary. "Margaret, it's Richard." The voice she had once found authoritative now sounded hollow and desperate. Margaret hadn't spoken to her ex-husband since the divorce was finalized, and she had no intention of resuming communication now. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," she replied calmly. "Please, just listen for a minute," Richard continued. "I've had 6 months to think about what happened between us, about the mistakes I made, about how much our 20-year marriage meant to me." Margaret continued reviewing her fabric samples while Richard spoke, noting how his tone had shifted from the demanding authority he had wielded during their marriage to something that sounded almost like pleading. "I've been going to therapy," he said, "learning about my behavior patterns, working on becoming a better person. I know I hurt you, but 20 years has to count for something." Margaret set down her coffee cup and gave Richard her full attention for the first time since he had called. "20 years does count, Richard," she said. "It counts as 20 years I'll never get back. 20 years of supporting someone who was systematically betraying me. 20 years of accepting less than I deserved because I believed marriage required that level of sacrifice. But it also counts as 20 years of learning exactly what I don't want in a relationship," she continued. 20 years of discovering that I'm strong enough to survive anything, including the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my own life." Richard was quiet for several seconds before responding. "I'm not the same man who hurt you, Margaret. Therapy has helped me understand how wrong I was about everything." "I'm glad you're getting help," Margaret said sincerely, "but I'm not the same woman you hurt either." That woman was afraid of being alone, afraid of starting over, afraid of disappointing people by admitting her marriage was a failure. She paused, looking around her kitchen with its evidence of independent choices and personal preferences. "This woman knows her worth," she continued. "This woman has built a life based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than financial dependence and emotional manipulation. This woman would rather be alone than accept treatment that diminishes her dignity." Margaret could hear Richard breathing on the other end of the line, apparently processing the reality that his ex-wife was no longer the malleable person he had married 20 years earlier. "What would it take," he asked finally, "for you to consider giving us another chance?" "It would take you becoming someone completely different," Margaret replied. "Someone who sees partnership as collaboration rather than control. Someone who values honesty more than personal convenience. Someone who understands that love is demonstrated through consistent respect rather than grand gestures after devastating betrayals." She stood up and walked to her kitchen window, where she could see Tom working in his garden with the same patient dedication he brought to their friendship. "But even if you became that person, Richard, I've already found what I was looking for. Peace, purpose, authentic relationships, financial security, and the freedom to make decisions based on my own values rather than someone else's expectations." The conversation ended with Richard's quiet acknowledgement that their marriage was truly over, not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually as well. Margaret felt a sense of closure that surprised her with its completeness. She no longer felt angry at Richard, or sorry for herself, or uncertain about her choices. She felt grateful for the journey that had led her to this moment of absolute clarity about her own worth and capabilities. That afternoon, Margaret met with Linda and Jennifer at their favorite coffee shop to discuss the expansion of Phoenix Rising into other Connecticut communities. Their success in Hartford had attracted attention from women's organizations throughout the state, and they were considering franchising their model to help women in smaller towns where resources were more limited. "I never thought I'd become a women's rights advocate," Margaret admitted as they reviewed their business plan. "I used to think feminism was something other people needed, not something I would ever require for my own life. Most women don't realize they need advocates until their marriages explode," Linda observed. "You thought you were in a partnership, but you were actually in a benevolent dictatorship that stopped being benevolent?" Jennifer leaned forward with the intensity she brought to all her investigative work. That's exactly why Phoenix Rising is so important. We're not just helping women escape bad marriages. We're teaching them to recognize warning signs before they waste decades of their lives. Margaret thought about the young woman who had contacted her just that morning, engaged to a man who was already showing signs of the controlling behavior that had defined her marriage to Richard. Financial independence after 50 is achievable, but financial independence at 30 is life-changing, Margaret said. If we can help women recognize narcissistic abuse patterns before they have children and mortgages in 20 years of intertwined finances, we can save them from ever needing to rebuild their entire lives. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with the three women planning strategies for helping other women avoid the mistakes they had all made in their own relationships. As they prepared to leave, Margaret received a text from Tom asking if she wanted to join him for dinner at a new Italian restaurant downtown. The invitation was casual and pressure-free, the kind of communication she had learned to appreciate after years of Richard's demands and expectations. She texted back a simple yes, then smiled at how uncomplicated healthy relationships could be when both people respected each other's autonomy and independence. That evening, Margaret sat across from Tom at a small table overlooking Hartford's riverfront, sharing pasta and conversation with someone who genuinely enjoyed her company without needing to possess or control her. "How's the Phoenix Rising expansion going?" Tom asked, demonstrating the kind of interest in her professional life that Richard had never shown. "Better than I expected," Margaret replied. "We're getting calls from women all over New England who want to start their own chapters." Tom raised his wine glass in a familiar toast. "To women supporting women," he said, "and to second chances that turn out better than first ones." Margaret clinked her glass against his, thinking about how much her definition of success had changed since her divorce. Success was no longer about maintaining the appearance of a perfect marriage or supporting someone else's career advancement. Success was having the courage to demand authenticity in all her relationships, the wisdom to recognize her own worth, and the strength to build a life that reflected her values rather than her fears. As they walked along the riverfront after dinner, Margaret felt the deep contentment that came from living in alignment with her principles. She had not only survived the destruction of her marriage, she had used that experience to create something meaningful for herself and other women. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who accepted lipstick stains and suspicious explanations because she was afraid of confrontation. Tonight, she was a woman who had transformed personal devastation into professional purpose, who had turned victimization into advocacy, who had discovered that her greatest strength had always been her capacity for growth and reinvention. When they reached her front door, Tom kissed her gently on the cheek, the same respectful gesture he had offered every evening for the past 3 months. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Margaret said, meaning it completely. "Thank you for sharing it with me," Tom replied, and she could hear in his voice the same gratitude she felt for finding someone who understood that love was about enhancement rather than possession. Inside her house, Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat in her redesigned living room, surrounded by furniture that reflected her personal taste rather than corporate entertaining requirements. Her laptop showed dozens of emails from women requesting help with divorce proceedings, business startup advice, and emotional support during their own midlife transformations. Each message represented someone who had decided to stop accepting less than she deserved, someone who had chosen courage over comfort, someone who was discovering that life after a difficult marriage could be better than life during it. Margaret opened her design software and began working on plans for her newest client, a woman in her 40s who wanted to completely redecorate the home she had kept in her divorce settlement. As she worked, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The slap that had changed everything hadn't just ended her marriage. It had awakened her to possibilities she had never considered while she was focused on being the perfect corporate wife. She had learned that women supporting women could accomplish anything, that financial independence after 50 was not only possible, but liberating, and that the most valuable relationship she could cultivate was the one she had with herself. The clock on her mantle chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in her new life. Margaret saved her design work, turned off her laptop, and prepared for bed with the satisfaction of someone who had spent her time purposefully. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new Phoenix Rising members, new opportunities to help women recognize their own strength and potential. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully in her own bed, in her own house, planning her own future, surrounded by choices that reflected her authentic self rather than someone else's expectations. The slap that had changed everything had ultimately been the best thing that ever happened to her, though she would never recommend that path to personal growth for anyone else. Margaret turned off the lights and walked upstairs, grateful for the journey that had brought her home to herself. Outside her bedroom window, the Connecticut suburbs were quiet and peaceful, full of women who were sleeping beside husbands who respected them, women who were sleeping alone by choice, and women who were lying awake wondering if they deserved better than what they had settled for. Margaret hoped that some of those women would find the courage to demand more, to investigate their suspicions, to document their evidence, and to build lives that honored their own worth rather than someone else's convenience. She fell asleep thinking about the design project she would complete tomorrow, the Phoenix Rising meetings she would facilitate next week, and the Italian vacations she and Tom were planning for next month. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret's dreams were about her own future rather than someone else's expectations. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful.